He was never supposed to be there in the first place. Bran Stark, the second youngest son of Lord Eddard Stark, had always been an adventurous child, forever testing the limits of his small world. He climbed the towers of Winterfell with a determined spirit, the soles of his boots scraping the stone, his breath fast with excitement. Even though his mother insisted that he not climb so high, he did it anyway, for the rush of it and the view it offered, a glimpse of the world from on high. On that fateful day when everything could have gone wrong, it did not. Instead of falling, Bran reached the top of the crumbling tower just in time to witness something he never should have seen. He blinked, his bright eyes adjusting to the half-light near the top of the abandoned tower. There, a sliver of afternoon sun sliced through the cracks in the ancient mortar, illuminating two figures. He squinted, for a moment unsure of what he was seeing, until he realized with a shock that it was the Queen, Cersei Lannister, and her brother, Ser Jaime, entangled in a manner that no sister and brother ever should be. Bran froze. The dusty wind swept through the openings, rustling his cloak. His heart hammered in his chest. Fear seized him, warring with confusion and shock. He had climbed high countless times and always believed nothing he found above Winterfell's courtyard would be more wondrous than the sky. But this was entirely new. This was terrifying and wrong and made his cheeks burn with confusion. He almost lost his grip, teetering precariously on the ledge. He nearly let out a yelp, but he bit the inside of his cheek to keep silent. He had climbed up in secret, and so no one had expected him. Even so, he was certain that any sudden noise would betray him. For an eternal instant, he stood transfixed, trying to decide what to do. Instinct told him to climb down immediately, to pretend he had never seen anything at all. But beyond that well of boyish innocence, something deeper in his heart told him that what he had witnessed was bigger than his own sense of danger. He had overheard his father speak quietly with Maester Luwin of intrigues and secrets. He had heard old Nan's stories of how the realm could be shaken by revelations of betrayal. A single whisper in the wrong ear, an entire kingdom changed. For the first time in his life, Bran felt the weight of something far greater than himself. He took a step backward, willed himself to remain silent, and slipped away down the tower, cautious with each foothold, each rung of the crude ladder, each step on the spiral stone steps. Shaken as he was, he did not slip. His mother had always said the gods gave him strong hands and agile feet, and on this day, those gifts spared him from a fall that would have changed everything in a different way. He reached the bottom and found his breath quick, his heart thrumming so loudly that he could feel it in his ears. He wanted to run, to find a place to hide, but the knowledge he bore urged him forward like a brand on his back. He had to tell his father. He had to tell someone who would know what to do. He darted across the courtyard, weaving between stable boys and Stark guards in their gray wool cloaks. A winter wind pulled at his dark hair. He felt that everyone could read his secret on his face, that they could hear the pounding of his heart. But no one gave him more than a passing glance. Winterfell was bustling with many newcomers. King Robert Baratheon, the Queen, and their entire retinue had only arrived a few days ago. There were knights, lords, ladies, squires, stable hands, and wagons upon wagons of supplies. All were busy settling in, polishing armor, grooming horses, preparing feasts. Bran half expected someone to stop him, to ask him why he looked so pale, but none did. He paused for the barest moment at the entrance to the great keep. He had never felt fear in the halls of Winterfell, for they were his home. Yet he was suddenly aware that around any corner might be the Queen or her brother. If they had seen him, would they not be searching for him now? The thought pressed him forward. He needed his father's calm, steady presence more than ever. So he crossed the threshold, ignoring the curious glance of a guard, and hurried through the corridors until he found his father's solar. Ned Stark was not alone. He stood with King Robert, the two of them locked in conversation. The door to the solar stood ajar. Bran approached so quietly that at first neither man noticed him. He heard them discussing some matter that sounded quite serious, perhaps the worry of Targaryen exiles across the Narrow Sea or the unrest in the Riverlands. Bran didn't care. He could scarcely register anything but the urgent drumming in his chest. He stepped forward and, in a voice that wavered more than he intended, said his father's name. Ned turned quickly, eyes softening when he saw his son's wide, frightened stare. Robert, meanwhile, raised a bushy eyebrow. "What is it, Bran?" his father asked gently, noticing the boy's pallor, the way he trembled. Bran looked at the king. Robert had always seemed jovial and loud, but at this moment, his presence was more intimidating than comforting. Yet Bran's father had taught him to always speak truthfully, especially when it might be important. "Father, I saw something in one of the old towers." He hesitated, wanting to look anywhere but into the eyes of these two great men. "I saw the Queen and Ser Jaime together, doing things. It wasn't right." King Robert's face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean, lad? What did you see?" Ned's own expression was growing grave. He put a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. "Take a breath, Bran. Speak plainly." And so Bran told them everything he could. His desire to climb, the vantage he found, the way he saw the Queen and Jaime together in a manner only a husband and wife should be. He spoke in halting phrases, face flushing with embarrassment. Yet the guilt he felt was not his own. He hadn't done anything wrong. Or had he? When he finished, there was silence. Ned Stark drew a slow breath, set his jaw. Robert Baratheon looked as though he had been kicked in the gut. The king ran a hand over his bearded jaw, mouth agape, and then he let out a roar that caused Bran to flinch. For a moment, Bran was certain the king was angry at him. But no, it was a fury directed elsewhere, a fury of betrayal and disbelief. Robert's big frame trembled with it. "That boy better not be lying," he growled at Ned, though the question in his eyes betrayed fear of hearing this news confirmed. Ned's voice was calm, but there was a tightness there that Bran had never heard before. "My son does not lie. If he swears he saw them, I trust him. But, Robert, this is treason." The king spat. He reached for the hilt of his sword, then hesitated, as though having trouble wrapping his mind around the enormity of Bran's claim. He shifted his stance, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each breath. "The Queen and her own brother, by the gods. Ned, if this is true, the ramifications, her children." He cut himself off, but the implication weighed heavy in the air. If Cersei's children were fathered by Jaime Lannister, then none of them had any right to the Iron Throne. It would mean Robert had been cuckolded, that the entire realm was living a lie. Ned's lips tightened as though he, too, was pained by the thought. He squeezed Bran's shoulder. Robert looked at the boy again. "You're sure you saw them? You're sure? By all the gods, boy, if you speak false." "I'm sure," Bran whispered, even as his heart pounded so strongly, he thought it might burst from his chest. "I'm sure." Robert's gaze flicked to Ned, and something like sorrow flickered there. Then he growled, "By the 7 hells, I'll have his head. And hers, if this proves true." He stood for a moment, seemingly paralyzed by anger and shock. Then he drew himself up, summoned the old warlord stance that made men cower on the battlefield. "Ned, I want no one else to hear this. Not yet. I need proof, you hear me? And if what the boy says is confirmed, then I'll act. I won't be made a fool in my own realm." Ned nodded. He turned to Bran and kneeled down so that they were eye to eye. "Go to your mother's rooms. Don't speak a word of what you saw, not to anyone. I'll come to you as soon as I can. Do you understand?" Bran nodded. He swallowed, tears threatening to burn in his eyes. He didn't want to cry, but the day's events overwhelmed him. Ned tousled his hair gently. Robert's thunderous presence loomed nearby, still trembling with rage. Bran felt small and fearful under that gaze, but he trusted his father. If anyone could make sense of this, it was Eddard Stark. Bran turned and slipped out of the solar. He started down the hall, pausing only once to glance back. He saw the king bury his face in his hands, saw Ned put a steadying hand on Robert's shoulder. Then the door closed, and Bran was alone in the corridor, his footsteps echoing against cold stone. Hours passed in a blur for Bran. He stayed in his mother's chambers at his father's command, quietly telling her only that he had witnessed something troubling and that father would explain soon. Catelyn Stark's protective instincts raged, but even she could sense that it was best to wait for Ned. She asked no further questions, though her worry seeped into her eyes. Meanwhile, Eddard Stark and King Robert held a private council within Ned's solar. No one else was admitted, not even Ser Barristan Selmy, who loitered outside the door in respectful concern. The conversation went well into the evening. By the time they emerged, Robert looked grim enough to start a war all by himself. There was the faint smell of ale in the air, though it was overshadowed by the tension that surrounded them both. Ned came to find Catelyn, and she joined the two men to hear what had transpired. Bran was left behind for only a short while, until Ned beckoned him forward to confirm the story. In hushed tones, Robert demanded more specifics from the boy. He asked how Cersei and Jaime had been standing, the position of their clothes, everything. Bran's cheeks burned with the memory. He told only as much as he had to, not wanting to linger on the details. But Robert wanted no ambiguity, and so asked again and again, until Ned intervened with a soft but firm hand on his arm. "You've pressed him enough." "Fine," Robert snarled. "I know what I need." His eyes flickered with a pained, furious sort of resolution. "We need to be certain. Bran's word is good enough for you, Ned, and it's good enough for me. But the realm may ask for more. The realm will demand proof. I will not be called a kinslayer if for some reason he's mistaken." Ned drew a breath. "He's not mistaken, Robert. He's my son. He may have child's eyes, but they do not lie." Robert said nothing to that. Then he stalked away, beckoning Ser Barristan in at last. Ser Barristan, the most honorable knight of the Kingsguard, who had served under the Mad King Aerys Targaryen once upon a time, wore concern plainly on his face. Robert murmured a few words to him, so low that neither Ned nor Catelyn could make out what was said. But Ser Barristan nodded gravely, and from the set of his jaw, it was clear that some intense course of action was decided. Ned shared a glance with his wife. Catelyn's eyes were full of worry, yet also a resolute hardness born of her love for her family. She wanted to see the queen cast out, that much was obvious. If Cersei was truly bedding her brother, that was an abomination that threatened the very unity of the realm. Catelyn voiced her concern in a whisper. "All these Lannisters. It's trouble, Ned. You know it is." Ned nodded. "Yes, but Robert is no fool. He's outraged, and we must tread carefully. The Lannisters command great power in the West. Lord Tywin Lannister is not a man to cross lightly. Any rash action could plunge the realm into chaos." Robert, hearing that, turned to them, voice rising with heated words. "Chaos? If the queen is betraying me, there's already chaos. I'll not abide it, Ned. I want Jaime brought to me. Now." That was the moment, the turn in the tide. Robert ordered Ser Barristan to take a contingent of 50 men, the most loyal men in the royal retinue, and seize Ser Jaime Lannister in the name of the king. Robert wanted them to do so discreetly, to avoid a bloodbath in the very halls of Winterfell, but also swiftly, to prevent Jaime from fleeing or mounting a defense. And Ned, sensing the danger, offered to send some of his own men, the most trusted guards in the Stark household, to accompany Ser Barristan. He would not let foreign men alone apprehend anyone within his own castle, nor did he trust that the Lannisters might not have other plans. 50 men, plus the stalwart knights of the Kingsguard, would be more than enough to secure Jaime Lannister, if it came to a fight. The company set out to find Jaime at once. Night was falling, and torches were lit in the courtyard. Guards bearing the crown's stag sigil and the Stark direwolf marched side by side. Robert stood on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, face ashen. He had not confided in Cersei. He wanted Jaime in chains before confronting her. All the while, Ned stood at his side, watchful and protective. He glanced back to see the silhouette of his son, Bran, peering from the ramparts. Though the father wished the boy would remain in his chamber, he understood the curiosity that propelled Bran to watch the events his testimony had set in motion. They found Jaime Lannister in the Great Hall, speaking with his cousin Lancel and a pair of knights from the west. He was in his gold-encrusted armor, the lions of House Lannister adorning his chest, the hilt of his sword shaped like a golden lion's head. He glanced up with wary eyes as Ser Barristan entered with a squad of armed men. Torchlight danced on the polished stone floors. A hush fell upon the hall. Jaime's smile faltered, replaced by an edge of tension. He laid a hand on the pommel of his sword. "Ser Barristan," Jaime said with a cordial tilt of his head. "To what do I owe this honor?" Ser Barristan's voice was stiff, heavy with regret but firm in duty. "Ser Jaime Lannister, in the name of King Robert Baratheon, you are ordered to lay down your sword and come with us. Will you submit?" The knights flanking Jaime exchanged uneasy looks. Lancel Lannister's mouth fell open. Jaime's eyes narrowed. "On what charge?" His tone tried for casual arrogance, but a hint of unease seeped through. Ser Barristan hesitated, glancing to the ring of men surrounding Jaime. "Treason," he said at last, quietly. "You will be informed of the details by His Grace." Jaime's nostrils flared. "And you expect me to just hand myself over like a good little knight? No explanation given?" Ned's men stepped closer, weapons at the ready. Lancel reached for his own sword, but Jaime pressed a hand on his cousin's arm, staying him. He was outnumbered. Jaime's lips twisted in scorn, and for a tense moment, he looked as though he might indeed draw steel despite the odds. He was the Kingslayer, the man known to have killed the Mad King with a single blow. He was as skilled a swordsman as any in the Seven Kingdoms. But even that might not help him now, surrounded by so many. And beyond that, the presence of Ser Barristan, an old knight, perhaps, but still one of the most formidable warriors in the realm, stayed his hand. A confrontation here would be madness. "Fine," Jaime said, his tone caustic. "I won't draw on old Selmy. I wouldn't want to kill a legend, but I do demand to see the king. Now." He unbuckled his sword belt with theatrical flair, letting it drop to the floor. "Take me to him." Ser Barristan nodded. Lancel protested, wide-eyed, but Jaime silenced him with a glare. "Do you honestly think I'd let them slaughter me here in the middle of Winterfell's hall, cousin? My father would not abide it, and Robert knows it. Let's see what this is about." And so Jaime allowed himself to be led away, a ring of steel around him, many pairs of watchful eyes. They escorted him through the corridors and up a flight of stairs until they reached the solar where Robert waited, posture stiff, eyes blazing. Ned Stark stood behind him, arms crossed, face grim. Catelyn Stark was absent now, having returned to watch over her children. But the tension in the air was enough that one could have cut it with a dagger. Jaime, unarmored except for the golden breastplate he had yet to remove, stared at Robert. "Well, Your Grace, I've been seized like a common criminal. Do I get to know why?" His tone tried for flippant, but a tremor of genuine worry lay beneath. Robert's expression was like a thundercloud. He advanced a step. Ned noticed the king's hand hovering near the pommel of his own sword. "Your incest," Robert spat, voice ringing off the stone walls. "I know. You and the queen." The last word was loaded with disgust and heartbreak, as though it tasted foul to say. Jaime blinked. For the briefest instant, Ned saw shock that matched guilt on his face. Jaime quickly schooled his expression into anger. "What nonsense is this?" The king's face reddened. "There's a witness. A boy, Ned's son, saw you rutting with your own sister in an abandoned tower. My own wife. You dare deny it?" Jaime's composure slipped. He threw a glance at Ned, then let out a disbelieving laugh. "Are you going to take the word of a child? Do you even know how tall that tower is?" Perhaps he saw something he misunderstood. Ned's voice was low, cutting in. "Bran knows exactly what he saw." Jaime's anger flared. "The boy is mistaken, or lying." He turned a look on Robert that wavered between fury and a flicker of uncertainty. "Would you kill me on the word of a child, Robert?" Robert pressed forward, a menacing presence, the king of the Seven Kingdoms in every inch of his bearing. "You call me by my given name," he growled. but you address me as your grace hereafter. Do you hear me? I am your king, and if you dare lie to me again, I'll have your tongue ripped out, you smug swine." A vein pulsed in Jaime's temple, but he forced a sneer. "My apologies, your grace." Robert exhaled, a ragged breath that contained grief as much as it did fury. "We will see if there's more evidence," he said at last. "If I find any at all to corroborate this filth, your head will rest on a spike. Until then, you are my prisoner." He gestured to Ser Barristan. "Take him below to a secure room, but not a dungeon cell. I want him guarded day and night. No visitors, not even Lannisters. No one but you, Ned, or me." Jaime, prideful even in chains, let out a derisive snort. "And what of my sister, the Queen? Do you plan to lock her up as well?" That question struck Robert like a blow. He gave Jaime a look of utter loathing. "Your sister," he said, voice full of venom, "will be dealt with if and when I choose. For now, you will remain where I can see you. Move." And move Jaime did, though not without one final jab. "Remember this, your grace," he said with a mocking bow. "You can lock me away, but you'll never change who I am. And my father will have something to say about this. I promise you that." Robert's eyes flashed. He clenched a fist, jaw set, but said nothing. Ser Barristan led Jaime out under heavy guard. Ned and Robert stood alone again. They looked at each other, weighed down by the reality of what had just transpired. "What do we do now?" Ned asked softly. Robert's voice shook. "Find proof. Gods, I should just throw her in the black cells and be done with it. But I can't. If I do, war breaks out tomorrow. Tywin Lannister won't take it quietly that we imprisoned his golden son, let alone his daughter. But I can't let this stand. By the Seven, Ned, that boy of yours, if he's telling the truth, he might have just saved the realm from a deeper lie than we could have imagined." Ned looked at the king's ashen face and placed a hand gently on his friend's shoulder. "You should speak to Cersei, Robert. If there is an explanation." Robert's bitter laugh held no humor. "Explanation? There's no explaining that. But yes, I'll speak to her. Not tonight. Let her wonder why Jaime's not come to her bed. Let her sweat. In the morning, I'll summon her. For now, keep your boy safe." Ned nodded, heart heavy. He thought of his family, of the quiet north that had been invaded by the storms of politics and secrets. He prayed to the old gods that he would keep them all safe. That night, Winterfell was abuzz with rumors. The men sent to seize Jaime had been seen marching through the halls. The Kingslayer was nowhere to be found, and speculation ran wild. Some said he had challenged the king to single combat and lost. Others said he had tried to kill King Robert. Others simply whispered in corners, exchanging fearful glances. The Lannister household men were on edge, demanding answers that none of the Starks or Baratheon men would provide. Meanwhile, the Queen's retinue was restless, as Cersei had retreated to her chambers, refusing visitors, or so it was said, though that was not entirely true. Cersei knew something was amiss the moment she realized Jaime was late to meet her. She grew anxious, pacing her lavish quarters. Her ladies-in-waiting ventured timid questions, but Cersei snapped at them. She dispatched a page to find Jaime. The page returned, stuttering that the Goldcloaks, those that came north with the king, refused to let him pass beyond a certain corridor. Cersei's eyes flashed. She demanded an audience with King Robert, but the page said the king was not to be disturbed. At that, Cersei's temper flared. She sent the boy away, then gathered what dignity she could, determined to find answers. Yet every corridor she tried was blocked by men she did not fully control, men loyal to the king or to Ned Stark. They bowed politely but refused her passage. Infuriated, she retreated, uncertain of what game was being played against her. As the hours stretched into the night, she found herself alone in her chambers, cold dread creeping through her veins. Had something gone terribly wrong? Jaime would have found a way to let her know if he could. No. She refused to consider the possibility that they had been discovered. But that possibility gnawed at her all the same. She spent the night sleepless, perched at her window, glaring at the courtyard below. Morning dawned gray and cold, a reminder that the North was no friend to outsiders. A messenger arrived at Cersei's door, stating politely but firmly that the king had summoned her to the Great Hall. She was to come immediately with minimal retinue. Cersei's stomach twisted. She chose only 2 of her ladies and, with as much regal bearing as she could muster, swept out of her chambers and descended to the Great Hall. There, the king waited on the dais, his large frame cloaked in a mantle bearing the Baratheon stag. At his right stood Eddard Stark, expression stony. Behind them stood Ser Barristan Selmy, grave as ever. About the hall were scattered men of both the Baratheon and Stark households, but conspicuously absent were the Lannister men. Cersei's eyes darted around, searching for Jaime. He was nowhere in sight. She stepped forward, her green eyes alight with anger and fear. "Robert," she began, letting the name linger, though it was as much a challenge as a greeting. "Why have I been summoned in this manner? Where is Ser Jaime? What is the meaning of these closed doors last night?" Robert's expression turned to stone at her familiar use of his name. "I am your king," he said coldly, "and you will address me as such." Cersei felt her heart hammer. This was not the drunken, jovial Robert she often manipulated with honeyed words. This was the man who won the Iron Throne by force of arms, who wielded a warhammer in battle and shattered the Targaryen line. "Your Grace," she said, forcing a bow of her head, "I demand to know the meaning of all this." A muscle in Robert's jaw twitched. "You demand? You, who might have betrayed me in the most abominable way." Cersei's composure nearly cracked. "I don't understand," Robert roared. "Don't play the fool with me. Jaime has been taken into custody, pending an investigation. A witness has come forth alleging unspeakable acts between you and your brother." Gasps rippled through the few onlookers who hadn't already known. Cersei's face paled, but she recovered with practiced speed. "What vile rumor is this? Who is this witness?" Her gaze flicked from Robert to Eddard Stark, whose stern face offered no comfort. Ned answered quietly, "My son, Bran." Cersei's lips twisted. "A child? We're to believe the word of a child? He must have misunderstood something. Or is this some ploy by your family, Stark, to discredit mine?" A flash of anger crossed Ned's features, but Robert interjected, "You think me a fool, woman? My best friend's son has no reason to lie about this. The boy's not even 10. You know as well as I do that the details he gave were explicit enough to ring true." Cersei's stomach lurched. That meant Bran had seen more than a fleeting glimpse. God's damn the boy. She swallowed, her mind racing to find some lie, some plausible explanation. "Perhaps your so-called witness is confused. Jaime and I are close, but we have always been so. We share a bond as twins. As for your claim of incest, it's absurd. You think I would risk the wrath of the gods themselves." She drew herself up, proud, defiant. "You have no true evidence. If you trust the realm to the word of a child, you are a weak king indeed." Robert's fury simmered just below the surface. Ned's hand hovered near his sword, as though he expected violence. But Robert reined in his temper, turning aside to pace. When he faced her again, his voice was lower, deadly calm. "I want the truth. Swear to me here and now that the boy is wrong. If you lie, the gods will punish you, if not I." Cersei's heart thundered. She considered lying outright, but to do so in the face of Robert's wrath might seal her fate if he found further proof. She weighed her options with desperate cunning. "You want the truth? Very well. The truth is that you've ignored me for years. Turn to your drink and your whores, fathered bastards across the realm. You have never truly loved me or our children. Yes, I found comfort with Jaime because you gave me nothing. Is that a crime? Is that so unbelievable?" Robert looked like she'd struck him. His face twitched with humiliation and barely contained rage. "So you admit it," he croaked, voice low. "You are a whore, then, whoring with your own brother. And you dare question my children's parentage. By the gods, the children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, are they mine?" Cersei saw a chance. She clung to it. "They are your children, Robert. all three born of the union the gods decreed. You think you can claim differently based on the prattle of a boy? Robert stared at her for a long moment. He had once fathered a black-haired child with a tavern wench in King's Landing. That much was widely rumored, if not outright confirmed. And the difference in hair color between Robert's dark Baratheon locks and the Lannister gold was something many had whispered about over the years. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were all golden-haired. Ned Stark, with his knowledge of lineages, found that suspicious. It was well known in the great houses that Baratheon blood usually bred true with dark hair, overshadowing the color of a spouse. The children's golden locks had always rankled Ned, but he had never found the conclusive proof he'd needed. Now, with Bran's testimony, the pieces seemed to fall into place. Ned met Robert's eyes, recalling the old tome of lineages he had read at King's Landing once. The genealogies that stated Baratheons always bore black-haired heirs when coupled with Lannister matches. Yet Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen had not a streak of black hair among them. He murmured quietly so only Robert could hear, "It is known that all Baratheons have black hair, save these." Robert clenched his fists. He recognized the significance. He knew the old line about seeds being strong, that Gendry, one of his known bastards, had the thick black hair of House Baratheon, just like his father. The contrast with Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen could no longer be ignored. Robert's face fell, grief mixing with a fury that threatened to devour them all. "You lying harpy," he growled at Cersei. "I should kill you where you stand." Cersei's chin rose defiantly. "Then do it, you coward. Stop hiding behind your men, behind your illusions of fatherhood. If you truly believe these children are Jaime's, then kill me." But there was terror in her eyes, no matter her brave words. She could see the storm in Robert's gaze. For a heartbeat, it seemed Robert might indeed strike her down. He was a big man, strong and quick with violence when roused. But he glanced at Ned, who shook his head subtly, reminding him that immediate bloodshed would tear the realm apart. Robert's sword arm lowered fractionally. Then he bellowed, "Guards, take her to her quarters. She is not to leave, and no one is to enter without my permission. Post men at every door and window. She's not to see or speak to anyone until I say otherwise. If she tries to leave, restrain her by force." A cluster of guards approached, clearly uncomfortable with the order, but bound to obey. Cersei's bravado faltered. Still, she tried to hold her head high as they surrounded her. She glared at Robert, then Ned, eyes flicking to Ser Barristan. "Do you think this will end well for you?" she hissed. "My father is Warden of the West, the wealthiest man in the Seven Kingdoms. He will not stand for this insult." Robert's face was impassive, cold as iron. "Let him come. I am the king." The guards gently but firmly escorted Cersei out of the great hall. Her ladies-in-waiting trailed behind her, trembling with fear. With the queen and the Kingslayer both in custody, it felt as though 1,000 storms were about to break over Winterfell. When the doors slammed shut and the echo of footsteps faded, Robert stood in silence, breathing heavily. Then he looked to Ned, eyes tortured. "Gods be good. It's all true, isn't it?" Ned nodded, his gaze dropping. "All the evidence points that way." Bran saw what he saw. The hair color, the rumors, it all fits. Robert cursed softly, then turned to his friend. "What in the seven hells do I do, Ned?" Ned paused, choosing his words. "You must consider the realm first. There will be consequences. Lord Tywin will not take this lightly. The question of succession will arise. If Joffrey is not your son, then your heir is your brother, Stannis, or perhaps Renly if the realm deems him more suitable. But these are matters best settled by wise counsel. This we cannot rush." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Wise counsel, as if I had that. My hand is dead in King's Landing, Jon Arryn. I came here to name you hand in his place, Ned. But everything is overshadowed by this nightmare." Ned drew a measured breath, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. "I will do my duty if you command it, but we must be careful. War might come if the Lannisters feel threatened." Robert's jaw set. I will not be blackmailed by that lion, Tywin. If war is all he understands, so be it. But first, let me think. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, their innocence in this, no matter whose seed they bear. I would not see children harmed for their parents' sins. But the throne belongs to the rightful heir. A hush fell over them both. The flickering torches along the walls cast long shadows on the floor. Finally, Ned said quietly, "We will see to it carefully. Shall I send ravens to your brothers, to the council in King's Landing?" Robert considered, then nodded. "Yes, but keep the letters brief, guarded. I don't want the entire realm to know yet. I want Tywin to hear it from me, not from gossip. Gods, the talk must already be halfway to the wall." Ned frowned. "We can slow it, but not stop it. There are too many watchers, too many tongues. Still, we can manage the official message." So it was decided. Ned Stark was formally named Hand of the King that very morning, before only a few witnesses. He accepted with quiet reluctance. The ceremony was overshadowed by the roiling tension in Winterfell. The Lannister men, Knights of Gold, prowled the corridors like caged beasts, uncertain why their liege lady and Ser Jaime were not in attendance. King Robert's retinue and the new household guard, beholden to the king and to Ned, stood watch at every intersection, ensuring that none could slip a message out or rally for a rescue. Yet it was impossible to maintain total secrecy. Whispers abounded, and dread hung thick in the air. Bran Stark remained in his room at his father's insistence, guarded by both Stark men and Baratheon knights. They feared that if the Lannisters learned who had witnessed their secret, the boy's life might be forfeit. Catelyn Stark hovered protectively, allowing no one near him save for trusted family and maesters. Rickon, too young to understand, clung to her skirts, while Robb, Sansa, and Arya exchanged anxious looks. The feast that night was a joyless affair, subdued and tense. Half the seats remained empty, most of the lords and knights having retreated to their own corners to await the next revelation. In the days that followed, King Robert questioned his queen again in private, with Ned present. She was defiant, insisting that Joffrey and the others were Robert's children, though she had loved Jaime all the while. "He might have me for it," she spat at Robert, "but he didn't father my children. They belong to the crown. If you deny them, you are no king, you are no father." Yet Robert's doubts were strong, reinforced by the genealogical truths Ned had laid before him. The more Cersei insisted, the more Robert's rage boiled. In anger, he struck her once, sending her sprawling. Ned had to drag him back, reminding him that an assault on a queen, wife or not, could spark ramifications. Robert's eyes shone with hate for the Lannister name and all it represented. Meanwhile, Jaime was interrogated repeatedly. At first, he mocked the questions, brushing them aside with arrogance. "Yes, I love my sister," he would say with a sneer, "but not the way you think. If you believed every rumor whispered in King's Landing, you'd have me bedding Tyrion as well. We Lannisters have thick skin." But as the days wore on, his flippancy waned. He refused to answer certain questions about the children, deflecting, changing the topic. Ned sensed that Jaime's pride was too great to allow him to break easily under simple questioning. He was a knight of the Kingsguard and believed himself above reproach. Yet the ring of evidence was damning, and Jaime's deflections only stoked the king's rage. Robert threatened to subject Jaime to more brutal methods, but Ned counseled caution, for a tortured confession would be seen as coerced, especially by House Lannister. War would be guaranteed. Still, Robert's temper was not easily cooled. The tension in Winterfell reached a boiling point. Tywin Lannister's men had not yet arrived, but messages must have found their way to the west, for the Lannisters loyal to Cersei and Jaime within the retinue were demanding their release or at least an open hearing. Robert refused, keeping them under lock and key. Rumors soared that Tywin was gathering his bannermen, preparing for a march north to retrieve his daughter and son. The Starks, likewise, sent urgent messages to their bannermen in the north, preparing to stand ready to defend Winterfell and the king if it came to that. The entire realm seemed perched on the brink of war. Bran Stark watched the developments from within the fortress of his family's care. He felt guilty, in a way, for setting these events in motion. His mother assured him that it was not his fault, that telling the truth was the only honorable course, and he had saved his life in the process. If Jaime had caught him in that tower, who knew what might have happened? But the weight was still there, and at night, Bran dreamed of climbing that tower again, of seeing Jaime push him. In the nightmares, he did fall, and woke in terror, twisting in sweat-soaked sheets. Sometimes, the dream was replaced by the memory of seeing Jaime with Cersei, the shame and the confusion that burned in his chest. Yet he told no one. He simply endured. One afternoon, as Ned was conferring with Robert in a side chamber near the crypts, they were interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest, Tyrion Lannister. The imp had finally come, apparently traveling from the Wall after a visit there with Jon Snow and Benjen Stark. Tyrion was disheveled from the road, hair dusty, and obviously confused by the tension he encountered upon riding into Winterfell's courtyard. Ned regarded him warily, uncertain whether Tyrion had come to champion his siblings or to gather news. Robert was similarly perplexed. Tyrion, for his part, demanded to know why Jaime and Cersei were being kept under guard. "I come back from a sojourn to the Wall, hoping to share some stories of the far north, only to find my dear brother in chains and my sweet sister locked away. What in all seven hells has happened here?" Ned explained the basics, that Bran had witnessed Jaime and Cersei in an act of infidelity and that the king was investigating. Tyrion's mismatched eyes widened, and for once, he seemed at a loss for words. "The boy saw them? And you took Jaime into custody? Seven gods. No wonder the castle feels ready to explode." Robert, still simmering with rage, turned his glare upon Tyrion. "You had best not try anything, imp. I've half a mind to lock you with the rest of your vile family." Tyrion bowed slightly, though he refused to show true fear. "I am a Lannister, your grace, but I have no taste for incest, and I prefer to keep my head. I only ask that you allow me to speak with Jaime or my sister. Perhaps I can glean something that will help you find the truth." "The truth?" Robert spat. "We have the truth. Your siblings are defilers, liar." Ned intervened, calmly as he could. "Let him speak to them. Tyrion may well uncover something. We may also gain valuable insight into what Lord Tywin might do." Robert glowered. He did not like Tyrion, for reasons of prejudice and old grudges against House Lannister, but Ned's counsel swayed him. "Fine," he ground out. "You may speak with them, but only in the presence of my men or Lord Stark. No private audiences." Tyrion nodded, lips thinning. "I shall do as you command. I want to learn the truth as much as you do. This is beyond rumor now, I see. If you'll excuse me, I'll freshen up a bit before I throw myself to the wolves." He gave Ned a half-smile at that phrase, referencing House Stark's sigil. Ned did not smile back. In the days that followed, Tyrion attempted to see Jaime, but Jaime refused to speak at length in front of the Baratheon guards. Tyrion gleaned only that Jaime was outraged, fearful for Cersei, and dismissive of the charges. "It's all a misunderstanding," Jaime insisted, voice dripping with sarcasm. "The child fantasized something, or so I suspect." Tyrion, ever perceptive, was not convinced by Jaime's performance, but he gleaned no direct confession either. For her part, Cersei raged at Tyrion when he visited under watchful eyes. "Help me, you twisted little toad," she hissed, "or I swear you'll pay. Father will not spare you if you side with these dogs." Yet Tyrion only gave her an exasperated look. "What can I do, dear sister? If you are innocent, your innocence will shine through. If you are guilty, you have only yourself to blame. At least tell me the truth, so I can help you." But Cersei clammed up, shooting him a furious glare. In a quieter moment, Tyrion cornered Ned Stark in the library. "My lord," he said, in a tone that lacked its usual mocking edge, "if I might have a moment of honesty, is your son truly so certain of what he saw?" Ned regarded Tyrion carefully. "My son speaks the truth." Tyrion nodded. "You know, I recall your son climbing about the castle. He has keen eyes and is bright for his age. I do not doubt him. But do you truly think Jaime fathered Cersei's children?" He spoke quietly so that no one else could hear. As improbable as it might be, it does explain a few things. Ned pursed his lips. I am certain, or near enough that the king is convinced. It is a dangerous truth, Tyrion. One that may plunge us into war. Tyrion sighed, rubbing his brow. My father is not a man to take a slight lightly. He spent years building alliances and establishing House Lannister's power. This is more than a slight. You have our queen locked up and Jaime imprisoned. My father will see it as a call to war unless some compromise is found. Ned exhaled. I know. I seek no war. But the king cannot let this pass unpunished, either. Tyrion's eyes glittered with cunning. A delicate predicament indeed. Perhaps I can reason with my father before matters escalate. If he hears from me, he might stay his hand at least for a time. Ned gave him a thoughtful look. You would do that? Tyrion bowed with mocking politeness. I do not particularly fancy a realm in flames, nor seeing my family undone. I will try, but I want safe passage south to speak with Lord Tywin. In return, I will promise to deliver your demands for justice, and to try to keep the lines of negotiation open. Ned considered. The king might not like it. Tyrion offered a faint smile. That is why I ask you first, Lord Stark. You are the hand of the king. You might persuade Robert to allow it. If war is inevitable, so be it, but perhaps I can slow it. For the sake of the realm. And, I confess, for the sake of my own neck. Ned studied the dwarf's face. Tyrion Lannister was no friend, but neither was he a fool, nor was he apparently consumed by the arrogance that drove the rest of his family. Perhaps he truly wanted to avert an all-out war. I will speak to Robert, but I make no promises. Tyrion bowed again, ironically. Then I shall remain here in your delightful Winterfell until you do. Ned left the library, a swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest. He found Robert seated in the Godswood, where the king sometimes went to brood. Robert had a jug of wine at his side, but it did not look as though he had drunk deeply. He was staring into the heart tree's face, carved centuries ago in the pale bark of the weirwood. The red sap tears dripped slowly, as though the old gods were lamenting the realm's sorrow. Ned told the king what Tyrion proposed. Robert let out a harsh laugh. He's cunning, that one. He might play both sides. Yet, perhaps you're right. If we can avoid war or at least delay it, that might be worth it. The realms had enough bloodshed. Ned was relieved. Then you will allow him to ride south? I will, Robert said, but not without an escort loyal to me. I won't have him vanish and spin some falsehood to Tywin. Robert drained a small measure from his jug. 7 hells, Ned. I wanted a hunt and a chance to rest here in the north, and instead I find this. I will not pretend I loved Cersei, or even liked her, but the humiliation. He trailed off, eyes distant. I'm going to kill Jaime, you know? Ned tensed. Not if the realm can be spared that. Not if justice can be done another way. The children. Robert's jaw set. Don't speak to me of those children. I don't even know if they're mine. Do you know how that feels? Ned bowed his head. I'm sorry, my friend. I cannot imagine. Silence hung between them for a time, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the murmur of water in the Godswood. Finally, Robert rose. Enough. Let us send Tyrion south. Let us gather what we can. If war comes, I'll gather my banners. Tywin may be powerful, but the king's armies and the north combined can stand against him. He paused, looking at Ned. Though I hope we can find a better way, for the children's sake, if not for Cersei's. So it was done. Tyrion was given permission, with a small armed escort from both the king and Ned, to ride south and speak to Lord Tywin. He parted with a mixture of relief and worry. Before leaving, he tried one last time to speak with Jaime, but the Kingslayer refused him an open conversation in front of the guards. So Tyrion departed, leaving behind a castle teetering on the edge of crisis. Days turned into weeks. Ravens flew in and out of Winterfell as swift as Ned's scribes could dispatch them. Messages from King's Landing were cryptic, indicating that the small council was in turmoil after receiving news that Queen Cersei might be indicted for treason. Grand Maester Pycelle wrote in coded language, urging caution. Littlefinger's letter was short, sarcastic, and offered no real help. Varys, the master of whisperers, sent a missive with riddling words about the fragility of secrets and the price of hidden truths. None brought clarity. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Winterfell grew more tense. Jaime, kept in guarded quarters, bored and furious, occasionally threw taunts at the guards, but he had no means of escape. Cersei remained locked in her rooms, gradually losing her composure. More than once, a crash or scream was heard from behind the locked doors. A lady-in-waiting emerged once, trembling, her cheek reddened from a blow. She would not speak of it, only scurried away. Robert seldom visited Cersei, for each time he did, they ended in furious arguments or violence. More than once, Ned had to intervene. The king's anger was unstoppable. Only Ned's presence could subdue him enough to prevent him from strangling the queen on the spot. Bran was protected carefully. The boy tried to resume some normalcy, even practicing archery with his brother Robb or watching as Theon Greyjoy displayed his skill with a bow. But under it all, Bran felt the stares of men. He knew that in their eyes, he was the reason a queen and a knight were in chains, the cause of a potential war. Some regarded him as a hero, others with guarded hostility. He even caught some of the Lannister men glaring his way, though they dared not attempt anything within Winterfell's walls. The presence of the king's loyal guard made sure of that. One night, as he lay awake, he heard the distant ring of steel. He sat up in bed, heart quickening. Was it a skirmish? An attempt to free Jaime or Cersei? He slid out of bed, creeping to the window. He saw torches bobbing in the courtyard, men rushing with swords drawn. At once, he thought of telling his father. But the corridors would be unsafe, perhaps. Then he remembered that Ned kept a contingent of men posted near the family quarters. Bran quietly slipped out of bed, into his cloak, and walked to the corridor where two guards stood. They recognized him immediately. "What's happening?" Bran asked, voice trembling more than he would like. One guard shook his head. "A disturbance, my lord. Seems some Lannister men tried to force their way into the wing where Ser Jaime is held. Our men are dealing with it. Lord Stark and the king are already out there." Bran swallowed. "Are they fighting?" "A few scuffles. The Lannisters demand to see Ser Jaime, claim we're holding him improperly. The king's men have refused them. Some swords were drawn. No serious injuries reported. Yet, the guard looked uneasy. "Your father told us to keep you safe in here." Bran nodded, relief and fear warring in him. He turned back to his room, but something compelled him to speak. "My father is strong. He'll see the right thing done." The guard said quietly. "He will." Outside, the confrontation did not escalate to full violence. Robert, in a fury, threatened to execute any man who drew steel without his leave. The Lannister men, outnumbered, eventually stood down, but the tension was at a knife's edge. Word spread the next morning that the ringleader of the Lannister men was placed under lock and key. Robert told them all that if there was another such attempt, he'd send heads back to Casterly Rock in a barrel. Time passed. The letters from Tyrion finally arrived. He had reached Casterly Rock, and he wrote that Lord Tywin was indeed mustering men, but had not yet declared open war. Tyrion reported that he was attempting to convince his father to negotiate. However, Tyrion also warned that Tywin demanded an immediate release of Cersei and Jaime, or else he would declare that the king was holding them unlawfully. The subtext was clear, a threat of war. Tyrion asked for conditions that might allow a face-saving compromise, but Robert saw red at the idea of releasing Jaime. "Never," he roared. "Not until I have proof, one way or another, of the children's parentage." Ned again tried to counsel caution, but Robert was beyond reason when it came to Jaime. The insult was too personal, the betrayal too deep. War seemed inevitable, with the armies of the West ready to march at Tywin's command. Yet something intervened that none foresaw. Word reached Winterfell from the Riverlands. A large band of men wearing the lion sigil had allegedly attacked some Tully outriders near the borders. Caitlyn's brother, Edmure, sent a raven describing the conflict. Outraged, the Tully men repelled the incursion, but tensions soared. House Tully was sworn to House Stark. Robert was outraged that Tywin's men would incite conflict outside of official channels, though he suspected it might be a vassal acting on their own. Regardless, the realm was fracturing. Sides were being drawn. Rival lords across the Crownlands and the Stormlands learned that the king believed the queen's children illegitimate, and some whispered that Stannis should be crowned. Others eyed Renly, who was more amiable and charismatic. In the north, the Starks prepared for war, but Ned urged for time to rally the bannermen, leaving behind a guard for Winterfell while the king considered returning to King's Landing to address the crisis. One evening, in the midst of these swirling troubles, Ned Stark summoned Maester Luwin and requested that he examine the color of Joffrey's hair more closely. A lock of the boy's hair had been saved from a recent cut. Luwin confirmed it was golden blonde, with no trace of black. Ned also recalled a conversation with Jon Arryn, long ago, about a phrase the late hand had repeated, "The seed is strong." That phrase referred to the Baratheon blood always breeding true. The genealogical records supported it. No matter how many times a Baratheon wed a Lannister, the children were black of hair until now. It was the final piece of evidence that Ned brought to Robert. He showed him the records, the locks of hair, the lineages. He reminded him that Gendry, the black-haired boy in King's Landing, resembled Robert more than Joffrey ever had. The truth was as plain as the snow outside. The children were not Robert's. Robert's fury was terrible to behold. For a time, Ned feared he might kill Cersei on the spot or order Jaime's head taken. But instead, Robert sat in the Godswood, weeping silent tears of rage and heartbreak. Ned stood beside him, giving him quiet support. When Robert finally stood, he said, "I will not keep this quiet any longer. I must announce it to the realm. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen are no heirs of mine. Let them keep the Lannister name. The throne passes to my brother Stannis." Ned, startled, asked, "What of the children? Will you punish them?" Robert's face was grim. "They are not mine. If Tywin wants them, let him have them. I will not see them harmed, though. They are innocents in this. But Jaime, Cersei, they must pay for this treason. Let Tywin do his worst." Ned heard the fatalism in his voice. With that, the die was cast. Robert prepared an official proclamation, naming Stannis Baratheon as his heir. He planned to travel to King's Landing with Ned, Jaime, and Cersei as prisoners, place them on trial before the lords of the realm, and let the truth be laid bare. War was all but assured. The next day, ravens flew with copies of the king's proclamation. The news spread far and wide. The final days in Winterfell before their departure felt like the calm before a storm. Robert's men made preparations for a royal entourage heading south, while Ned gathered his own retinue to march with them. Jaime was told he would be brought to King's Landing in chains, to stand trial. He scoffed, "Better for you to kill me here, Stark, than let me face your southern dogs." But Ned only offered a cold stare. Jaime tried once more to see Cersei, but Robert forbade it. Cersei, for her part, had fallen into a cold, silent fury. She refused all visitors, no longer taking meals. Occasionally, she would fling her dinner tray at the guards, but otherwise she raged in silence, a caged lioness with nowhere to run. Bran watched from a distance as the courtyard filled with wagons, guards, knights, and supplies for the trek south. He felt no excitement. Once, he had dreamed of traveling to King's Landing. Now, it felt ominous. His mother insisted that he and Rickon remain in Winterfell, safe behind the walls, while Ned, Robb, Sansa, and Arya journeyed south with the king. Bran did not argue. A part of him felt relief at avoiding the city, but another part, the adventurous side, felt the pang of being left behind. Yet, after all he had experienced, perhaps staying behind was the safer course. On the morning of departure, the air was crisp, frost glittering on the ground. Cersei was escorted, pale and haggard, onto a wagon fitted with barred windows. Jaime, similarly restrained, rode in the back of a separate wagon, guarded by a half-dozen men. The Lannister men watched in seething silence, powerless to intervene. Robert mounted his warhorse, Ned at his side. Sansa and Arya stood near a carriage, subdued, hearts heavy. Robb clutched his sword hilt, uncertain but trying to appear resolute. Theon Greyjoy was at his side, smug with the sense of being on the cusp of war. Ironborn found war exhilarating, but Theon's loyalty was to the Starks for now. The banners of House Stark and House Baratheon fluttered in the wind, side by side. The direwolf and the stag marched as one. They would travel to King's Landing as a show of unity, but it was a unity perched on a precarious blade's edge. Bran, standing on the ramparts with his mother and baby brother, watched as they departed. Horses whinnied, steel clanked, wheels creaked. The king's entourage filed out of the gates, heading south. Bran caught glimpses of Jaime and Cersei through the wagon's narrow openings. Neither looked back at Winterfell. The boy tried to imagine what might happen next. Would the Lannisters gather their full might? Would the realm descend into war? Would the truth stand? He had no answers, only the memory of that moment in the tower when he had stared at a secret so dark it threatened to break the realm. Somehow, fate had spared him from falling that day. Perhaps that meant the realm itself had a chance to avoid collapse. He did not know. He whispered a prayer to the old gods for his father, for the king, for the good of the realm. And so they rode south, with the snows of the north at their backs and the fires of war igniting in the distance. The realm was on the cusp of being forever changed. The winds of winter howled faintly, as though heralding a new age of conflict. And in the hearts of all who knew the secret, there was a sense that the Game of Thrones had only just begun.